The world knew North Africa as an exotic land of camels, pyramids, desert heat, and ancient history. In World War II, modern history was written here. In 1942, Adolf Hitler, master of Europe, was expanding his grasp on North Africa from Libya to Morocco. He had put the French colonies of Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia under command of the Vichy French, his Nazi puppet government. But the British maintained a presence nearby at Gibraltar and Egypt. Erwin Rommel, Germany's most celebrated general, was chosen to lead the mighty Africa Corps against the British in an attempt to seal off the Mediterranean from the Allies. The battle for North Africa would be an early, crucial turning point of World War II. 7 months after Pearl Harbor, Churchill and Roosevelt met to plan a strategy for North Africa. The Prime Minister convinced FDR that a U.S.-led invasion would bolster British forces there and give the Americans valuable combat experience. The invasion could also open up a route for a backdoor attack of Nazi Europe. General Dwight David Eisenhower was appointed to lead the Allied invasion, Operation Torch. For several months, however, the British would remain on their own, facing a most formidable opponent. Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, was a brilliant soldier and tactician. He worried, however, that his armies would be outgunned by fresh American men and equipment. The Nazi hierarchy was not sympathetic. Hermann Göring sneered, "All the Americans can make are razor blades and refrigerators." Rommel answered, "I only wish, Herr Reich Marshal, that we were issued similar razor blades." In August, Winston Churchill arrived in North Africa. He appointed an aggressive new leader for the British Eighth Army, General Bernard Law Montgomery. Known as Monty to his men, he was also a strong tactician, but more cautious than Rommel. His instructions from Churchill were clear. Your prime and main duty will be to take or destroy at the earliest opportunity the German-Italian army commanded by Field Marshal Rommel. The stage was set for a battle between two legends. In 2 months' time, Monty began his offensive against the Germans, which would culminate at El Alamein. In a stroke of good fortune for the British, Rommel had fallen ill and left North Africa for 3 days' treatment in Austria. The Africa Corps was without its greatest asset, the Desert Fox. Montgomery surprised the Nazis with an intensive World War I-type artillery barrage, followed by infantry and tank charges. So thunderous was the shelling that Rommel's replacement, General Stumm, suffered a fatal heart attack, while the German army suffered a lethargic and disorganized defense. On the third day of battle, Rommel returned, as he put it, to save what can be saved. Against Hitler's wishes, he withdrew his battered German troops. The British victory in the Battle of El Alamein was a devastating setback to the Nazis, the pivot point of the North African campaign. The importance of the El Alamein victory was summed up by Winston Churchill. "It is not the end," he said. "It may not even be the beginning of the end, but it is undoubtedly the end of the beginning." The victorious British rolled on, but the costs of El Alamein had been high. 250 tanks and more than 13,000 casualties. Even so, they had succeeded in shaking up the previously unshakable Germans. Rommel pleaded with Hitler for fresh troops and supplies. Hitler, distracted by events on the Russian front, ignored him. The Führer's decision would prove disastrous. As German officers continued to surrender, the Americans were about to join the fray. Eisenhower, from his headquarters in Gibraltar, mapped out the plan for Operation Torch, the long-awaited American invasion of North Africa. Landings were planned for Algiers, Oran, and French Morocco near Casablanca. The Allies hoped the Vichy French troops would turn and fight against their Nazi occupiers. Pleas were broadcast to the Vichy French in their own tongue, including one appeal direct from Washington.
Nous arrivons parmi vous seulement pour écraser et pour anéantir vos ennemis. Croyez-nous bien. Nous ne voulons vous faire aucun mal. Rendez-vous concours où vous pouvez, mes amis, et nous verrons revenir le jour glorieux quand la liberté et la paix régneront de nouveau dans le monde. Vive la France éternelle!
More than 500 Allied warships now began a surprise assault on the three targets. American GIs stormed the beaches carrying the stars and stripes in the hope that the Vichy French would not fire on them. But Vichy French bullets took their toll of American lives, with the most stubborn opposition coming from Casablanca. Finally, when Vichy commander Jean Darlan was captured in Algiers, he persuaded his soldiers to yield to the Americans, who were quickly tightening a noose around all three cities. Ike wanted to keep the momentum going. He planned to swiftly move his troops toward Tunisia and attack the Germans before they could be resupplied. If it worked, Ike's pressure from the north and Monty's pressure from the south could oust the German army from North Africa. Meanwhile, by sea and air, the Nazis raced to build up their forces in preparation for the expected Allied attack. They airlifted 1,500 men a day to Tunis from Sicily in a race against time. By late November, the Allies were within sight of Tunis. But 30,000 German troops, most of them newly arrived reinforcements, were waiting for them. The unseasoned Americans were driven out of Tunis by the German Panzer M4s, stronger tanks than anything the U.S. could offer. By air, the Americans were introduced to the superior might of the Luftwaffe, taking off from Axis bases in Italy and wreaking havoc over North Africa. Ike's gamble had failed. American troops were humbled by the still mighty German army. The new year of 1943 brings a surprise visitor to war-weary GIs in North Africa.
It's 10 o'clock, and here is the news you've been waiting for. Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill have met on the soil of Africa at Casablanca. They drew up battle plans for 1943, plans designed to bring about the unconditional surrender of Germany, Italy, and Japan.
The German Supreme Commander of the Mediterranean, Albert Kesselring, comes to North Africa to meet with General Rommel. The Desert Fox informs Kesselring that he plans to attack the Allies through the mountains of western Tunisia at Kasserine Pass. Rommel's plan is to knock out the vital Allied communication and supply stations at Tebessa. On February 19th, the German attack begins. The Americans are taken by surprise and thoroughly beaten. But the victory is a Pyrrhic one for Rommel. Rommel had broken through the Allied lines, but the savage fighting left him with only 1 day's ammunition and very little fuel for his army. He was forced to withdraw. This last gasp German offensive turned out to be Rommel's final victory in North Africa. Rommel knew the depleted North African German forces could not hold out against the ever-growing number of Allied soldiers and supplies. He implored Hitler to abandon North Africa. The Fuhrer screamed, "Africa will be held," and placed Rommel on sick leave. The Germans were left with a weary army, 76 functioning tanks, and so little gasoline that their soldiers attempted to distill fuel from local wines and spirits. In April, the Allied armies of the North and South linked up to wrap up the North African campaign. By mid-April, Bizerta had fallen. Soon, Tunis was again in sight. This time, the German army could not defend it. This is the once mighty Afrika Korps. With their defeat, North Africa was firmly in Allied hands. If Hitler could have secured the Mediterranean, he might have maintained his stranglehold over Europe. Instead, the Nazis now had a two-front war on their hands, with North Africa the launching point for the Allied invasion of Italy. Young, cocky, battle-hardened German pilots dominated the skies over Europe for much of World War II. To pave the way for a D-Day invasion, Allied bombers would need to demolish the Luftwaffe in the air and Nazi war production on the ground. The stage was set for the battle for the sky over Europe. The U.S. declared war on Germany in December of 1941, and President Roosevelt immediately let the world know that Britain would receive a giant boost in firepower.
Hitler and Mussolini, they will understand now the enormity of their miscalculation. That the Nazis would always have the advantage of superior air power, as they did when they bombed Warsaw, and Rotterdam, and London, and Coventry. That superiority has gone forever. We believe that the Nazis and the fascists have asked for it, and they're going to get it.
It was America's bombers that were going to give it to them. By late 1942, American factories were producing hundreds of bombers a month, slated to strike at Germany from air bases in Britain. The huge B-17 was America's foremost bomber. Its thick armor and 13 machine guns earned it the nickname the Flying Fortress. Strategists hoped the long-range B-17 could reach key targets without escort fighters. These bombers would have to fly great distances to bomb key German targets from bases in England and North Africa. Even the longest-range Allied escort fighters could only protect them part of the way. After that, they were on their own, against Germany's best. And it was the Focke-Wulf 190 that Germany's best flew. The Focke-Wulf's speed and maneuverability made it especially deadly to flying fortresses early in the war. The Allied strategy was to strike at the heart of the German war machine, their factories and their energy sources. The vast oil fields at Ploesti, Romania, deep inside the Nazi Empire, were a prime but perilous target. Unconventional, low-level bombing was devised by the Allies to avoid Germany's primitive radar. The Ploesti raid was emblematic of the Allies' problem. Although 40% of the target was destroyed, German fighter planes brought down 54 American bombers and their crews. We desperately needed longer-range fighter planes to escort our bombers on these crucial raids. In the hope of breaking the spirit of the German people, Allied bombers struck at civilian targets. In Hamburg alone, 45,000 Germans were killed in 4 days. All that remained was a skeleton of a once great city. The Allies' spirit was nearly broken as well. On almost every long-range mission, Allied bombers flew into a hornet's nest of German planes. Control of the air remained necessary if Allied land forces were to eventually invade Europe. The missions continued.
One more diving through the 94th.
3 planes, 9 o'clock, coming around. Keep your eye on, boy. Coming around to 10.
Watch them, Chuck. Keep your eyes open.
Yeah, they're breaking at 11. Breaking at 11. I got them.
I see him.
At 2 o'clock. Watch them, Scotty.
Don't yell on that intercom.
Check it B-17, Chuck. 3 o'clock. Motor smoking. Fighter at 10:30, coming around.
B-17 out of control at 3 o'clock. Get out of there. Come on, you guys, get out of that plane. Bail out.
The bombers that did make it back to England were often seriously damaged, with hundreds of injured crew to attend to. These long-range attacks without fighter escort protection led some airmen to rename flying fortresses flying coffins. Despite the threat of being killed in the air or surviving in a German POW camp, Allied pilots persisted. The sheer number of sorties the Allies flew finally began to strain Germany's air defense and factories. Industrialist Albert Speer, Germany's war production czar, had a strategy that allowed most German factories to be up and running within days or even hours after being hit by Allied bombs. Through the use of slave labor, Speer dismantled and dispersed his factories by train so that no single Allied airstrike could have a crippling effect. But even Speer's Herculean efforts were not enough to match the massive production capability of the Allies. In early 1944, the production of 2 unique American long-range fighters proved the pivot point in the battle for the sky of Europe. With extra fuel tanks slung underneath, the P-47 Thunderbolt could fly to Berlin and back to protect the bombers. And then there was the versatile P-51 Mustang. The P-51 was faster than almost anything else in the sky, and its range of 1,400 miles could protect Allied bombers on the longest of missions inside Nazi Europe. American bombers were no longer alone. The P-51 and the P-47 outfought anything the Luftwaffe could put in the air. In the first few months of 1944, the Allies shot down more than 4,000 German planes.
I got him. Quinlan, confirm that fighter.
He got him, Chief. Look, he's bailing out.
I'm on him. Come on, use him.
By June, the Luftwaffe was crippled. Allied bombers struck at will, day and night. Allied control of the air soon led to Allied control of the ground. As the invasion of Normandy was launched in June of 1944, it was air power that kept the Germans at bay. General Eisenhower confidently told his men, "Rest assured that if you look up during the invasion and see a plane coming towards you, that it is one of ours." GIs advancing through the Reich in 1945 were greeted by a bleak moonscape of craters and gutted buildings, the result of daily Allied poundings designed to protect our troops as they moved towards Berlin. Victory in the battle for the sky over Europe paved the way for victory over Hitler and Germany. On the night of June 5, 1944, the greatest armada ever assembled left southern England, bound for the coast of France. Winston Churchill called it the most difficult and complicated operation ever to take place. The plan was officially called Operation Overlord, but history remembers it as D-Day. D-Day could only succeed if the Allied forces were united under the direction of a firm hand. That firm hand belonged to General Dwight David Eisenhower. Ike had little combat experience, but his penchant for planning made him an ideal choice. Bernard Law Montgomery, the arrogant British commander who had fought the Germans in North Africa, was under Eisenhower and resented it. Known to his men as God Almonte, he was put in charge of the British and Canadian ground forces for the invasion. Ike chose General Omar Bradley, his calm and able friend, to lead the American land forces. Throughout the spring of 1943, war-weary England was besieged by an invasion, not from Germany, but from 1.5 million American GIs. The Brits said the American soldier was overpaid, oversexed, and over here. The Americans replied, "You Brits are underpriced, undersexed, and under Eisenhower." This was not the first invasion of Nazi-occupied France. In August of '42, a disastrous, poorly planned raid was attempted by Canadian and British forces at the northern French port town of Dieppe. One regiment lost 80% of its men, but many lessons were learned. Lord Mountbatten would say, for every soldier who died at Dieppe, 10 were saved on D-Day. The Germans knew that an invasion was imminent. The question was when and where. Hitler's hunch was Normandy, but his aides dismissed it. They believed the Allies would instead invade a port town to land the huge amount of necessary supplies. Hitler chose Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox of the North Africa campaign, to build a 1,600-mile Atlantic wall from the Netherlands to Spain. With slave labor, Rommel fortified every inch of beach, placed millions of mines offshore, and built thousands of pillboxes with 13-foot thick walls and massive artillery. Rommel was convinced that success lay in repelling the enemy on the beaches. He said, "The first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive for the Allies as well as Germany. It will be the longest day." The Desert Fox had coined a phrase for the ages. Rommel's superior, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, disagreed. He believed that nothing could prevent the Allies from piercing the Atlantic Wall. Von Rundstedt instead wanted to keep a large mobile panzer division in reserve, then quickly shift it to the site of the Allied invasion. By 1943, each month, American war production was creating 140 ships, 2,500 tanks, 15,000 jeeps, and 8,000 airplanes, much of it heading for England. But how to hide such a buildup? The invasion could only succeed if the Germans could be kept guessing. General George Patton kept them guessing through Operation Fortitude, a huge hoax designed to lead German intelligence to believe that the Allied invasion would take place at the Pas de Calais, where the Channel was at its narrowest. To further the deception, Patton kept himself highly visible at the headquarters of his fake invasion force directly across from Calais. And there was more to the plan. Thousands of misleading radio transmissions were leaked to German intelligence to keep them off balance. Fake tanks and jeeps, called dummies, were strategically placed throughout England to divert attention from the true buildup in the south. The magnificent deception caused the Germans to hold a major part of their forces near Calais, well away from the Normandy beaches. The hoax had worked. In the spring of 1944, in preparation for the invasion, Allied pilots shot down 3,000 German planes. The Luftwaffe would not be a factor on D-Day. Allied air power also focused on the French railways. These air attacks were designed to cripple German supply movements by rail towards Normandy. D-Day -3. The Allied invasion fleet sits ready, waiting for the green light from General Eisenhower. Ike has a 3-day window of opportunity for the most favorable weather combination of late moon rising and high tide. D-Day -2. A storm sits over the Channel. Ike wakes to this gloomy forecast, and after conferring with his meteorologist, he decides to wait a day. D-Day -1. Rommel is back in Germany to celebrate his wife Lucy's birthday. He has told von Rundstedt the invasion is not imminent. For Lucy's birthday, Rommel brings a fine pair of shoes from Paris. That same day, Ike is informed that the Normandy weather may clear by the morning of the 6th. Ike knows if D-Day is postponed again, it will be 2 weeks before the right conditions occur. He calmly says, "Okay, we'll go." The Allied plan is to send paratroopers inland to protect the flanks of the beach landing. A naval bombardment will follow at daybreak. The British and Canadians will then invade the beaches codenamed Gold, Juno, and Sword, while the Americans invade Utah and Omaha. Finally, the combined Allied air and sea forces will link up to form a breakout for Paris. By the evening of June 5th, the largest naval armada in history slowly approaches Normandy. The sea is choppy. Men from states like Minnesota, Nebraska, and Iowa are earning their sea legs the hard way. Back in England, Ike visits with the men who will be first to face the enemy, the airborne. They will come into Normandy by glider or parachute. It is a bittersweet moment for Ike, who knows that 70% of these gallant young men are expected to be wounded or killed. Ike's final message leaves no doubt of the task ahead.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expedition. Your task will not be an easy one. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory.
More than 12,000 Allied aircraft crossed the Channel that night. In contrast, the Axis had only 169 planes. A German defender recalled, "We looked up and there they were, sailing in over our heads. We lay on our backs and fired until we could not work the bolts on our rifles anymore." But with such masses, it seemed to make little difference. 24,000 paratroopers descended on Normandy. Most of the British hit their mark. 3/4 of the 16,000 Americans were scattered across the landscape, victims of confusion and miscalculation. Throughout the morning hours of D-Day, the Americans scrambled toward their objectives. Many never made it. The Germans on the Normandy coast had no illusions about what was happening. Nazi headquarters, however, was literally asleep. Rommel was called at his home in Germany 3 hours after the air assault began, but Hitler's aides were afraid to wake the Führer until the invasion was officially confirmed. Von Rundstedt, the only commander awake at this point, eventually got through to Hitler and requested reinforcements. Hitler, still convinced by the great Allied deception that the real invasion would come at Calais, delayed his response for 7 hours. That delay proved to be the pivot point of D-Day. A sea of Allied ships sent salvo after salvo thundering into Hitler's Atlantic Wall. For the Allies and the Germans, too, the longest day had begun. As Allied landing craft neared shore, their naval guns stopped the barrage to keep from hitting them. It was enough for them to avoid the German fire. But life or death at Normandy depended mostly upon which of the 5 beaches you landed upon. At Utah, American landing craft near the shore. The Americans wade through 100 yards of surf to the flat beach. It is oddly quiet. Many of the Germans at Utah have been killed or dazed by the massive Allied bombardment. The Americans move quickly inland. Utah is a resounding success. 2 British and 1 Canadian division come ashore at Gold, Juno, and Sword. 4 years after the Nazis began their reign of terror over England, the British finally put them on the defensive. There are more than 1,000 casualties here, but the bloodiest landing will transpire at Omaha Beach. At Omaha, a sea of blood is shed. Allied air attacks had missed the German machine gun nest at Omaha due to poor visibility. In the first wave, one inexperienced American unit facing the best-trained German division in Normandy suffered 96% casualties in just 3 minutes of battle. In choppy seas, 27 amphibious tanks were sunk. Most of the men drowned inside. If you made it to shore at Omaha, you were soon pinned down against 100-foot cliffs, with the tide creeping in. Inspiration to move on, whatever the price, was provided by Colonel George Taylor. He raced across the sands, crying out, "The only people on this beach are the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." Individual acts of heroism finally took out the German gun positions. By late afternoon, at a cost of 1,000 lives, the Americans took control. Shortly after, Ernest Hemingway came ashore. He wrote, "The first, second, third, fourth, and fifth waves lay where they had fallen, looking like so many heavily laden bundles on the flat, pebbly stretch between the sea and the first cover." The success of D-Day allowed the Allies to land at will on the French beaches. The Germans had lost their stranglehold on Europe. By July 1st, more than 1 million Allied soldiers would arrive on French soil. Within 2 months, Paris would be liberated and the Allies would cut a path towards Berlin. D-Day opened the way to victory in Europe. For most of the war in the Pacific, U.S. carrier pilots suffered as much as the Japanese. Crash landings were an all too common feature of carrier combat. By June of 1944, however, Japan's Air Force was facing a shortage of experienced pilots, while America had an ever-growing group of veteran aces. These U.S. carrier pilots were about to annihilate Japanese naval air power in a showdown so one-sided it's remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Throughout 1944, the United States swept through the Pacific. They had crushed Japan at Midway and pushed them out of Guadalcanal and Tarawa. After seizing the Marshall Islands, the U.S. began looking for a way to soften up the Japanese mainland in preparation for an American invasion. America's new B-29 bombers could carry a heavier payload than any other plane in the world. But an airstrip was needed within striking distance of Japan from which to safely launch the bombers. American strategists decided that the B-29s could best reach the mainland from the Japanese-held Marianas Islands, just 1,300 miles from Tokyo. But first, they needed to clear out the Japanese. Step one was the invasion of the island of Saipan, the most heavily defended in the Marianas group. Then Guam and Tinian. A massive U.S. naval presence would be stationed offshore to attack the Japanese Navy should it attempt to move into the area. In charge of the U.S. Armada was Admiral Mark Mitcher, who had taken part in the Battle of Midway and in Doolittle's raid. Mitcher was given command of a huge force of 15 aircraft carriers with enough planes to ensure protection of the U.S. landing forces. On June 16th, the invasion was launched, with 20,000 American troops going ashore at Saipan on day one. 20,000 more GIs would follow in the next few days, enough manpower to overwhelm the Japanese defenders. After learning of the invasion, the Japanese rushed a carrier task force towards the Marianas to confront the American Navy and repel the U.S. landing force. The Japanese had but 9 carriers with 430 aircraft to face off against the mighty U.S. fleet. Commanding Japan's task force was one of the Imperial Navy's most respected leaders, Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa. The admiral would normally not have risked his fleet against such odds. He was counting, however, on an additional 540 planes stationed at air bases on Guam and other nearby islands to assist him in his attack. Knowing his country could not afford to lose the coming conflict, he told his men, the fate of the empire rests on this one battle. As American soldiers move inland, the pivotal battle was about to be fought in the air, offshore. The Japanese launched their air attack at a distinct disadvantage. Most of their experienced pilots had been killed in previous conflicts. Japanese flight schools had given new airmen only a few months' training before rushing them into combat. They had little chance against the veteran U.S. pilots. To add to their disadvantage, the most common Japanese plane, the Mitsubishi Zero, had become outdated. The Zero's speed and maneuverability had made it a great success in dogfights, but America now had faster, better armored planes. Mitcher's carriers spotted the Japanese planes on their radar soon after they'd been launched.
Pilot, man your plane, pilot. Man your
U.S.
plane.
pilots, most of whom had served in the Pacific for as long as 2 years, rushed to their planes to meet the enemy. Many of these American pilots would be flying the new Grumman Hellcat, the Pacific's best fighter plane. It was faster, sturdier, and had more firepower than its Japanese counterpart. Only 90 miles away from the American carriers, the two sides spotted each other, and the battle began. Unfortunately for the Japanese, it was no contest. Ozawa's young pilots were so inexperienced they failed to take advantage of their Zero's maneuverability, losing their only potential advantage. The quicker, tougher Hellcats began to down one Zero after another. "They're falling like leaves," declared one excited American pilot. Another cried out, "Hell, this is like an old-time turkey shoot," giving the battle its name, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Dozens of Japanese planes were destroyed in a matter of minutes. On board his flagship, Ozawa waited for his planes to return in triumph. When most did not return, he made a foolish assumption that proved to be the pivot point of this battle. In what can only be judged in hindsight as an act of wishful thinking, Ozawa decided that his missing planes must have flown on to refuel at the nearby Japanese air base at Guam. Unaware of the magnitude of his losses so far, he launched a third and fourth wave of planes right into the meat grinder. Ozawa's final waves met with the same fate as those before them: utter destruction. Many young Japanese pilots were knocked out of the sky before they had the chance to fire their guns. By the end of the day, 300 Japanese pilots had been shot down, while the American losses totaled 29. To make matters worse for the Japanese, U.S. subs spotted Ozawa's task force. The Americans launched their torpedoes and sank 2 of Ozawa's carriers. The next afternoon, the battle continued. What was left of Ozawa's fleet was retreating, but U.S. planes pressed on with their attack before the Japanese could escape their reach. American dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters damaged several of Ozawa's warships and bagged 65 more Japanese planes. With only 35 planes left, Ozawa watched helplessly as U.S. planes demolished the Hiyo, the 3rd carrier sunk in the battle. It was the final humiliation in this ignominious defeat. American planes headed back towards their carriers, triumphant but low on fuel. Only 20 U.S. planes had been downed in their attack on Ozawa's fleet. But 80 more planes were lost when they were ditched by their pilots or crashed as they ran out of fuel. On board the carriers, ceremonies are held for airmen who have returned victorious only to be found mortally wounded in their cockpits. For these men, their planes will become their final resting place. The most one-sided aerial battle in history has resulted in the utter defeat of Japan's air power in the Pacific. After the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the Japanese were never again able to launch a major aerial offensive in World War II. An entire generation of Japanese aviators had been wiped out. Ozawa's defeat, the loss of the Marianas, and the final blow to Japan's air power hit the homeland like a bombshell. Many in government now saw the war as unwinnable. They worried that with the Marianas as a base, the Americans would now strike directly at Japan. Premier Hideki Tojo, who had personally guaranteed that the Marianas would never fall, was forced to resign in disgrace. The capture of the Marianas was one of the war's great turning points. The B-29 attacks Japan so feared soon began. Meanwhile, in New Mexico, U.S. scientists were perfecting a bomb to launch from the newly captured Marianas. A weapon so powerful that it would end the war and change the course of history. In 1942, shortly after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Army invaded the Philippine Islands and routed the U.S. forces stationed there. At Bataan, more than 12,000 American troops surrendered following an heroic struggle. It would be 2 years before America could attempt to retake the Philippines in what would begin with the grandest naval battle in all of history, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. General Douglas MacArthur, commander of America's forces in the Philippines, escaped just before the defeat, vowing, "I shall return." Throughout 1942, 43, and 44, MacArthur led U.S. Army forces north from Australia towards the Philippines. From the east, Admiral Chester Nimitz led the Navy in the second half of a two-pronged American offensive. At U.S. headquarters in Pearl Harbor, it was decided that the Army and Navy would join forces in America's return to the Philippines. But which of the 28 Philippine islands should be the target of the invasion? U.S. brass decided on the southernmost major island, Mindanao, and plans for the invasion began. But Admiral Bull Halsey told his superiors he had a better idea. Halsey's carrier planes had been attacking Japanese positions in the Philippines for several weeks. He reported facing little opposition over the Philippine island of Leyte. A new plan was quickly arranged to take advantage of Halsey's discovery. Unknown to Halsey, however, the Japanese had also hatched an ambitious plan for the Philippines. Shoichi Go. They would risk every available ship in an apocalyptic final showdown with the U.S. Navy. Japan knew if they lost the Philippines, their navy would also lose access to its fuel supply in the Dutch East Indies. It was time to risk all and, if necessary, go down fighting. Shoichi Go called for 4 Japanese carriers to serve as decoys, luring American carriers away from Leyte's beaches. Land-based planes around the Philippines would then take off to support the real attack. A main force led by Admiral Nishimura would steam up from the south to engage the remaining American fleet. And an even larger group, led by Admiral Kurita, would come down from the north to finish off the American ships and soldiers left stranded on Leyte. To ensure success of their mission, Kurita's armada included the Musashi and the Yamato, the 2 largest battleships the world had ever seen. On October 20th, the American invasion of Leyte and the Philippines began. More than 160,000 GIs hit the beaches over the next several days. The landings were met by light resistance. That same day, Douglas MacArthur fulfilled his promise to return.
When I landed on your soil, I said to the people of the Philippines whence I came, I shall return. I have returned.
The U.S. Army began pushing inland, counting on the U.S. Navy to protect their vulnerable beachhead from any Japanese naval counterattack. To protect U.S. land troops, 2 naval forces were stationed in the Gulf, one with 6 battleships, the other with 18 small escort carriers. An armada of 16 fleet carriers and 87 warships under Bull Halsey was also nearby, ready to destroy the Japanese fleet should it appear. And so it did. The Japanese Navy moved towards Leyte to launch the first phase of their offensive, but their plan was undermined by the unexpected. Their ground-based planes, counted on for crucial air support, were manned by inexperienced pilots, some of whom had never been in combat before. Combat-hardened airmen from Halsey's 3rd Fleet went up to face these fledgling Japanese pilots. The battle for Leyte Gulf had begun. In a series of dogfights that day, U.S. aces quickly shot down more than 1/3 of the 200 planes manned by the far less experienced Japanese pilots. The few Japanese planes that did get past U.S. fighters were greeted by a withering stream of anti-aircraft fire. Wave after wave were shot down by American guns. Incredibly, one Japanese pilot snaked through the thick wall of fire that had destroyed every other plane in his group. He dropped a 550-pound bomb that smashed through the carrier USS Princeton, which eventually succumbed to the damage, taking the lives of more than 300 sailors. Now the American pilots had their turn. Halsey's planes found Kurita's force at sea hundreds of miles from Leyte Gulf. They crippled one cruiser and damaged several other ships. But their real find of the day was the battleship Musashi. With the Imperial Navy planes attacking at Leyte, the unprotected Musashi was destroyed and sunk by the American pilots. Kurita called off his part of the assault and turned back. But the day wasn't over. Halsey's scouts had spotted the Japanese decoy carriers far to the north of Leyte. Aware of Kurita's retreat, Halsey decided to take the bait and chase the carriers. He ordered his ships to head north. Unknown to Halsey, however, Kurita had changed his mind. He turned around and led the Japanese force south towards Leyte's vulnerable American landing beaches. Meanwhile, Admiral Nishimura leads the southern prong of the Japanese assault, unaware that the Americans are lying in wait. America's Admiral Ohlendorf, informed by native coast watchers of Nishimura's approach, prepared a surprise or two. 5 U.S. ships, resurrected from their graves at Pearl Harbor, are ready to get their payback. These ghosts of Pearl Harbor have come back to haunt the Japanese. During the early morning hours of October 25th, Ohlendorf's fleet moved into position to spring his trap. The Japanese, coming through the strait, saw only tiny PT boats standing between them and Leyte's beaches. They advanced at full speed, directly into range of Ohlendorf's big guns. Ohlendorf called the battle the most beautiful sight I have ever witnessed. By morning, virtually every ship in Nishimura's force had been blown to pieces. Thousands of Japanese sailors had been killed by the shells or drowned in Leyte Gulf. With Ohlendorf cleaning up to the south and Halsey far to the north, Kurita's main Japanese force now closed in for an assault on Leyte's Gulf. The only thing in Kurita's way was a tiny American force, mostly small, unarmored escort carriers and destroyers under Rear Admiral Raymond Sprague. Sprague's modest group was about to face off against the full might of Japan's greatest warships. Kurita had the remaining strength of the Japanese Navy, including the huge Yamato and 3 other battleships. At 8 a.m., his guns opened fire. The Yamato launched thunderous volleys from its massive 18-inch guns. The attack was unexpected and devastating. Sprague could not hope to match the Japanese firepower, but he also could not leave the Leyte beachhead undefended. He decided his only course of action was to attack. First, he had his ships lay down a massive smoke screen. His men rushed to action, his destroyers opening fire to keep the Japanese at a distance. Sprague now launched all the planes from his escort carriers to strafe and harass the Imperial battleships. These planes helped to distract the large Japanese ships. Sprague radioed a desperate call for help, realizing he could not hold out for long. At daybreak, Halsey received the SOS in the middle of his attack on the decoy carriers. Unhappy to leave the battle, the admiral reluctantly steamed south to rescue Sprague, but left behind just enough ships to finish his attack. The Japanese on these decoy carriers knew they were doomed, but their successful sacrifice had put Kurita far to the south on the verge of victory. In the next few hours, all of the Japanese decoy carriers were sunk. Back at Leyte Gulf, Sprague was on the ropes. One of his carriers and two of his destroyers had been sunk. Most of his other ships were damaged. Hundreds of U.S. sailors had lost their lives to the big Japanese guns. And then, the unexpected happened. In the pivot point of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Kurita suddenly calls off his assault. Sprague's spirited response had mistakenly convinced Kurita that he was facing a much larger force. To add to the confusion, a Japanese radio operator intercepted a message that Halsey's fleet was on its way. At that moment, Kurita could have easily destroyed the American landing force, but fearing he was falling into a trap, Kurita fled. One U.S. sailor yelled, "Hell, they're getting away!" A major Japanese victory had been turned into a bitter defeat. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was over. It had cost Japan 10,000 men, 4 fleet carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 288 planes. A surprised Japanese Navy had been devastated by losses from which they would never recover. On shore, MacArthur's army met with considerable success. It would be 4 months before the capital of Manila was captured, but victory in the Philippine Islands was in sight. It was time to celebrate. The U.S. had won the Battle of Leyte Gulf.
I am intensely proud of the successes our fighting men have won over the Japanese, and I'm sure all of you share this feeling. Our latest successes are but steps along the road to victory, and it will not stop until the Tokyo war makers are utterly defeated.
December 16th, the triumphant cheers died down in Europe. In the Christmas season of 1944, nobody was predicting that the war would end by Saturday night or a week from Wednesday. And today, with the good news from all fronts singing on all radios, let us remember the dying days of 1944. The infantry remembers those days. They were not being reconverted for civilian production, nor were they worried then or ever that they would be left with too many shells or too many tanks. The Army had come fast and far last fall. We had developed a certain tendency to become complacent. Complacency came to an end in time for the Christmas season. These men had never been complacent. As they fought, they did not seek employment in civilian industry that would secure them after the war. They did not complain about the scarcity of butter or roast beef or the high cost of living. The cost of living on the Cologne Plain was considerably higher than in the United States, but they did not discuss it in their clubs. In December, we learned all over again the bitter lesson of war. War is conducted in mist and turmoil and uncertainty. Victory comes on no silver platters. The enemy sells nothing cheaply. The enemy is resourceful, courageous, desperate. The Nazi Party is willing to sacrifice every building and every soul in Germany to stave off defeat. Reserves of men and materiel had been hoarded for the day of counterattack. Under cloudy skies and close-hanging ground mists that defied aerial observation, the very much alive German army gathered its forces in the forest aisles to strike one strong, decisive blow at the American army. New and refitted divisions were brought up under cover of fog, darkness, and forest. A fury of robot and rocket weapons was unleashed against our front. In one day, the enemy smashed through the defenses of the American First Army on a 45-mile front and was biting deep into Luxembourg and Belgium. In 24 hours, the initiative changed hands, and the German army, which had put the word blitzkrieg into all languages, unleashed its desperate offensive. They had picked a time when the weather prevented us from using the air weapon, the weapon in which we decisively outweigh them. This film is being shown for the first time. It was captured from a German cameraman. He had taken it so that the German home front might gloat over the evidence of the success of Rundstedt's attack. In August, it was German convoys that were caught like this along the French roads. Now it was our convoys, ruined, burning where they'd been overrun. The sweat and iron of Detroit and Pittsburgh became the wreckage of Malmedy and Saint-Vite. We lost more than jeeps and half-tracks, tires and shells, tanks and guns. We lost men, 78,000 in dead, wounded, and missing. Unarmed and defenseless American prisoners, comrades of these men, fell to the machine guns of our enemies. Fire! 4 weeks later, their frozen bodies, hands and ankles bound, were found where they fell. These Belgian enemies of the Third Reich, too, were unarmed and defenseless. Germans smoked camels and Chesterfields robbed from American dead. And the Nazi cameraman filmed it to amuse and reassure the moviegoers of Munich and Berlin. Men who had not retreated since their arrival in Europe plodded back along the mean roads of winter Belgium. Convoys of trucks streamed to the rear with supplies that had been painstakingly accumulated at forward dumps. Supplies that could not be moved were put to the torch. Millions of man-hours of work to be put in all over again. To stop counterattacks, huge new reserves of supplies are called for. But that is how a war is. Wasteful, unpredictable, uncertain, dangerous, demanding constant wariness, constant preparation for the worst, a constant and unflagging spirit in the face of all alarms and disasters. Gallant American units, surrounded and cut off, fought in a sea of enemy armor. Anti-aircraft guns were fired point blank as anti-tank guns until they were overrun. Cooks, bakers, quartermaster, and line of communications troops picked up their rifles and fought tenaciously against Nazi columns. The weather cleared and the Air Force took to the skies to bomb and strafe and fight the rejuvenated Luftwaffe to the ground. The army held in Belgium. The attack was blunted, the spearhead stopped, the Nazi columns contained and thrown back by men who had flung themselves into the breach. In the wild gamble of war, a momentary equilibrium had been gained. The cost had been great, and there were no guarantees being issued on engraved paper on the Western Front that the time of counterattacks was over. In the general uncertainty of war, one fact remains certain. The enemy is always dangerous. The enemy always wants to kill Americans. The enemy does not slack off.
In 1945, the Pacific Ocean stood for anything but calm and peace. An epic confrontation was about to take place on an 8-mile parcel of land the Japanese called Sulphur Island. The only value of this land was its strategic airstrip just 625 miles southeast of Tokyo. If taken, the outpost could become the Allies' closest base for continued bombing of Japan. The capture of the island was expected to take 10 days. It took 36. The bloodiest assault in the history of the U.S. Marines took place on Iwo Jima. By the fall of 1944, the Americans were rapidly closing in on the Japanese. In June, American brass decided to continuously bomb Tokyo. They hoped to break Japanese morale and force an unconditional surrender. Iwo Jima was key to these plans. Iwo's proximity to Japan meant fighter escorts could accompany bombing runs over Tokyo. Until this point, America's B-29 superfortresses had flown these missions alone. To take Iwo would give the Americans a dagger aimed at the heart of the enemy. General Tadamichi Kurebayashi commanded the Japanese on Iwo Jima. In the 1920s, he had taken cavalry training in Texas. He knew America well. To his wife, he wrote, "The United States is the last country in the world Japan should fight." Fearing that Japan was being backed into a corner at Iwo, he decided to dig in, literally. The Japanese constructed a honeycomb of caves, pillboxes, and bunkers stocked with food and electricity and connected by internal communications. Kurebayashi's plan would allow the Americans to come ashore. Then he would butcher them with mortar and machine gun fire from strategically located pillboxes. The 22,000 Japanese on Iwo were prepared to die for the emperor. Kurebayashi told these men, "Once the invasion comes, every man will resist until the end, making his position his tomb."
Iwo Jima, Japanese citadel 625 miles from Tokyo. An invaluable base for consistent bombing of Japan. Warships of the massive American Fifth Fleet gather off Iwo. By sea and by air, Iwo Jima is subjected to more than 70 days of bombardment, the heaviest of all on the last 3 days before the landing. The moment of assault draws near.
On February 19th, 60,000 U.S. Marines invaded Iwo. The morning erupted into a firestorm of shells and rockets. A war correspondent on one of the ships wrote, "I can't help thinking nobody can live through this, but I know better." The shelling stopped as 120 carrier planes strafed the island with napalm and gunfire. But the ferocious bombardment had failed to rouse the Japanese from their underground shelters. It just kept them awake. The Marines were also awake. At 7:30 that morning, they boarded their landing craft for a 2-mile trip into the unknown. Mostly veterans of other Pacific struggles, they knew only one thing for sure. They would confront a dangerous and devious enemy. Hands up, strip, come here, come out. These were the Japanese phrases Marines attempted to master. But such small talk would be of little help against an enemy willing to sacrifice his life for the Emperor. It was expected that 15,000 of these Marines would become casualties. As it turned out, the figure was conservative. The first wave hit the beach at 8:59 a.m. The Marines were surprised by the light resistance. The enemy was drawing them in to disaster. The Marines' first great obstacle was the volcanic sand, so loose that American tanks could barely get a grip on the stuff to move inland. One exasperated private trying to dig a foxhole said, "It's like digging a hole in a barrel of wheat." But by 5 p.m. that day, 30,000 Marines were on the shores of Iwo Jima. The U.S. force had successfully landed near Mount Suribachi, unaware that inside the extinct volcano lurked 1,200 Japanese soldiers ready to pick off the approaching Marines. From the Japanese perches high atop Suribachi, the Marines were vulnerable to mortar and machine gun fire on every inch of Iwo. The only way to attack the entrenched Japanese positions was from up close. As the Marines cautiously climbed the flanks of Suribachi, they could actually hear the Japanese talking inside the volcano. For the next 4 days, those foreign voices would be systematically silenced by flamethrowers and hand grenades. But in those 4 days of fighting, more than 1,500 Marines were also killed. There seemed no end to the Japanese resistance. The Leathernecks needed a lift. One group of tenacious Marines finally made it up the north face of Suribachi. They claimed this hunk of volcanic rock in a stunning moment which America and the world would never forget. Perhaps the best remembered image of World War II. The site of Old Glory, proudly waving over Mount Suribachi, inspired the thousands of Marines below. It was the pivot point in the battle for Iwo Jima. By the 6th day of battle, the Marines had captured the island's largest airstrip. American air power was at Japan's door. There was some hope that conquering the rest of the island would be less costly. It was not to be. The Marine death toll mounted as Japanese mortar shells were fired from Iwo's northern end. The Marines had to traverse rocky terrain embedded with Japanese snipers to reach General Kurebayashi and his men. And the Japanese were taking the general's orders to fight to their death quite seriously. 4 Marines fell for every yard taken. In 1 hour, 94 Marines were killed trying to cross a space of 100 yards in front of one cave. When the Marines couldn't coax them out or shoot them out, they burned them out. 10,000 gallons of flamethrower oil were used up in each day of battle. "36 days after the U.S. invasion, the enemy surrendered. Of the 22,000 Japanese that originally occupied Iwo, only 1,000 survived. The rest had fought to their death. Kuribayashi's body was never found. The taking of the island cost more than 5,000 American lives, but the U.S. Marines had won the fiercest battle of their history. Of the bloody struggle, Admiral Chester Nimitz said, "On Iwo Island, uncommon valor was a common virtue." As the Japanese Empire crumbled in 1945, soldiers of the rising sun gathered for a last stand against an expected U.S. invasion at the island of Okinawa. Throughout March of 1945, the American Navy closed in on the island, located just 400 miles from Japan. In their last-ditch efforts to protect the mainland, the Japanese would rely upon a special breed of warrior, the kamikaze pilot. The final step on the road to Tokyo would be the Battle of Okinawa. Kamikazes would make sure it was the costliest. Admiral Mark Mitcher was chosen to lead the U.S. Navy carrier task force towards the island. Mitcher knew carriers well. This naval aviator began flying off and landing on aircraft carriers in 1928. Now, 17 years later, his carrier force began softening up Okinawa prior to the U.S. invasion. For 2 weeks, the Americans pounded the island. Their barrage was 20 times heavier than the bombardment of Nazi defenses on D-Day. Easter Sunday, April 1st, 1945. 170,000 American combat troops come ashore relatively unopposed. One soldier landing safely comments, "I've already lived longer than I thought I would." General Simon B. Buckner led these ground forces. This Army veteran came from a family of military tradition. During the Civil War, Buckner's father fought for the Confederacy and lost to Ulysses S. Grant. But any wisdom passed on from that experience could not have prepared Buckner for the tenacity the Japanese were about to display on Okinawa. On April 4th, the Americans ran into Japanese resistance for the first time, resistance that would stiffen as the days wore on. General Mitsuru Ushijima was in charge of the defense of Okinawa. He did not want to waste any of his 100,000 troops along Okinawa's beaches. Instead, he decided to make his stand at the two ends of the island. The strongest defensive position was at the Shuri line to the south, where the Japanese could hide in caves and hills. Ushijima would allow the Americans to come ashore, let them readily move inland, and then kill as many as he could. Meanwhile, Japan's kamikaze planes would destroy as many U.S. ships as possible. Ushijima's plan was a desperate one, and a dangerous one for the Americans. On April 6th, the kamikazes stepped up their attacks. These pilots were named after a legendary divine wind that had wrecked an enemy fleet in the 13th century, saving Japan from invasion. Some of these young men had but 12 hours of flight training, but they were Japan's last hope of turning the tide. The kamikaze planes were loaded with bombs and only enough fuel to reach their targets, the American aircraft carriers. But the young pilots' jangled nerves made them less discerning. Soon, not just the carriers, but every U.S. ship became a target of the suicide planes. The kamikazes had no trouble finding American ships. In rapid succession, they hit the U.S. carriers Intrepid, Franklin, and Wasp. And they kept on coming. In the first 24 hours of battle, hundreds of American lives were lost as the human bombs darted from the sky to find their targets. Throughout April, the land battle on Okinawa was brutal. The Americans progressed slowly, yard by yard, house by house, as the Japanese slowly fell back toward the south end of the island. Like two tired fighters, both sides pounded each other into exhaustion. GIs frequently gave a hand to otherwise helpless civilians caught in the crossfire of battle. This American camera slate speaks to the fear the Japanese had instilled in Okinawans who were told the U.S. Marines will kill them. When the locals emerged from their hiding spots, they found they had been misled by the Japanese. Unfortunately, a few Okinawans accepted the Japanese lies. Some, like this woman, jumped to her death rather than face the Americans. More than 30,000 civilians, mostly island farmers, were killed or wounded during the battle. But American troops earned the trust of those civilians who survived. Japanese soldiers killed thousands of GIs in the first few weeks of battle. What the Americans thought would be easy became more difficult day by day. Increased pressure was put on General Buckner to end the Battle of Okinawa. Each day of the stalemate left U.S. supply ships and their crews vulnerable to the kamikazes. General Isamu Cho, Ushijima's second-in-command, formed a desperate plan to recover lost ground. Cho convinced Ushijima to launch a massive counterattack against the Americans across the Shuri Line in early May. But Cho's reckless plan left the Japanese exposed to an American artillery barrage. This Japanese offensive turned out to be a bloody failure. It was the pivot point of the Battle of Okinawa. "6,600 Japanese soldiers died in the action. For 6 weeks, the battle dragged on offshore. More than 1,900 kamikaze attacks were made. Although only 1 in 10 of the kamikazes were getting through, 36 American ships were sunk and 368 damaged. The U.S. carrier Bunker Hill was hit on its flight deck. planes loaded with bombs and gasoline detonated like a string of firecrackers, turning the ship into an inferno. When the smoke cleared 6 hours later, the ship was dead in the water. Although Japan's supply of kamikaze pilots seemed endless, their supply of planes was not. They simply ran out of aircraft. The U.S. fleet had survived, battered but not broken by the kamikazes. As June wore on, the Japanese wore out. They fell back to a final position on the craggy south end of the island. It would take 2 U.S. Marine divisions to clear them out. The Marines searched every cave and cranny for Japanese soldiers. Flamethrowers and hand grenades were used to flush out the enemy. Dazed and exhausted, a few Japanese soldiers were taken prisoner. Most chose to die fighting. On June 18th, just after this film was shot, General Buckner commented, "Things are going well here." Moments later, with victory but 3 days away, Buckner was killed by a Japanese shell. On June 21st, the Japanese surrendered. Their losses were catastrophic. 110,000 soldiers and civilians had perished. Only 7,400 soldiers were left alive. Ushijima and his staff committed harakiri. The empire had suffered its largest loss of life and worst defeat in history. More than 12,500 Americans lost their lives in the Battle of Okinawa. During the 82 days of fighting on this small Pacific island, the world had vastly changed. President Roosevelt had died. The Germans had surrendered, and the former senator from Missouri was contemplating the use of an atomic bomb against Japan. The Americans did not realize that Okinawa would be World War II's final battle. America now faced a momentous decision: to invade Japan or to drop the bomb.
Like a chime from heaven, it sounds around the world. Victory. From a prime minister to a GI private, a movie queen to Rosie the Riveter. V for victory. Whether painted on the fuselage of a flying fortress or scratched on the thick wall of a concentration camp, is the hallmark of inevitable triumph. And at last, victory is realized. It had been war without quarter, of torturous struggle in battle after battle. A war that savaged everyone who died in it or managed to live through it. A people's war in which no one was exempt. Not Second Lieutenant Ronald Reagan. Not Army Sergeant Joe DiMaggio. Or Air Force Captain Clark Gable. Or Naval Lieutenant John F. Kennedy. Nor were your fathers and grandfathers, uncles and great-uncles, your pastors and rabbis, your grandmothers and school teachers and librarians. They not only defended democracy, they defined it. If you enjoyed the program that you just watched, contact your DVD provider about other Questar DVDs or visit www.questarentertainment.com.